On February 5th, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations Security Council with what he called ironclad proof satellite imagery, intercepted phone conversations, intelligence reports. He held up a vial claiming it represented the amount of anthrax Iraq possessed. He told the assembled nations, "Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence." It was all lies. Every single claim Powell made that day was fabricated. The aluminum tubes weren't for uranium centrifuges. The mobile biological weapons labs didn't exist. The yellowcake uranium purchased from Niger was based on forged documents. The links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda were completely invented. When Chief Weapons Inspector David Kay finally admitted the truth in January 2004, he said simply, "We were almost all wrong." But here's what nobody talks about. If weapons of mass destruction weren't the real reason for invading Iraq, what was? Because the United States spent over $3 trillion, killed hundreds of thousands of people, occupied the country for 8 years, and left it in complete chaos. That's not the kind of investment you make for nothing. There had to be a reason, a real reason, and there was. On November 6th, 2000, 2.5 years before the invasion, Saddam Hussein made a decision that signed his death warrant. Iraq announced it would no longer sell oil in US dollars. Instead, all Iraqi oil would be sold exclusively in euros. American analysts laughed. They thought Saddam had made a catastrophic economic mistake. The euro was trading at 82 cents to the dollar and had fallen 30% since its launch. Experts predicted Iraq would lose millions. But here's what happened instead. Just 2.5 months after American troops entered Baghdad in March 2003, Iraq's oil sales were switched back to US dollars. Not after finding weapons, not after establishing democracy, not after rebuilding infrastructure. The first major economic policy of the occupation was returning Iraq's oil to dollar denomination. If that doesn't tell you what the war was really about, nothing will. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Minute. Today, we're going to expose the real reason America invaded Iraq. And it has nothing to do with terrorism, weapons, or spreading democracy. Stick around until the end to understand the multiple factions that benefited from this historically destructive war. All right, let's get into it. Let me explain what the petrodollar system is and why the American leaders felt it was worth killing for. To understand it, we need to go back to 1971. For decades after World War II, the US dollar was backed by gold under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Other countries could trade their dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. This system worked great initially, but by the late 1960s, it was collapsing. The US had expanded the welfare state with massive entitlement programs while maintaining a warfare state with perpetual military spending trade deficits. Accumulated, gold reserves dwindled as countries sought to trade dollars for gold. The US didn't have enough gold to meet its obligations. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon did something radical. He ended dollar convertibility to gold. The dollar became a pure fiat currency with no commodity backing whatsoever. This created a massive problem. Without gold backing, why would anyone hold dollars? Global demand for dollars could collapse, destroying American economic power. Then came October 1973, the oil crisis. Arab nations imposed an oil embargo after Nixon supplied Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled from $3 to $12 per barrel overnight. This created both a crisis and an opportunity. The US needed a way to maintain dollar demand after abandoning gold, and they found it through a secret deal with Saudi Arabia. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement that would reshape the global economy. The deal was kept secret until 2016, but here's what it involved. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all oil exports exclusively in US dollars. They would refuse payment in any other currency. They would convince other OPEC nations to adopt the same policy. And they would invest their surplus oil revenues, recycle petrodollars, back into US Treasury securities, US government debt, and American financial markets. In exchange, the United States agreed to provide full military protection for Saudi oil fields, guarantee security for the kingdom from its neighbors, including Israel, supply advanced weapon systems and military equipment, and provide political and diplomatic support for the Saudi regime. By 1975, all of OPEC had adopted dollar-only oil pricing. The same incentive structure, weapons, military aid, protection, convinced the entire cartel. This created something extraordinary. Every country on Earth needs oil to function. Oil is only sold in dollars. Therefore, every country must hold dollar reserves. Even US adversaries like the Soviet Union and China were forced to accumulate dollars just to buy oil. This artificial global demand for dollars replaced the gold standard. Instead of good as gold, the dollar became good as oil. And oil is more essential to modern economies than gold ever was. More transactions, more demand, and oil consumption only increases over time. Here's what this system enables. The Federal Reserve can print dollars without immediate inflation because other countries absorb the dollar supply to buy oil. The US can run massive deficits that would bankrupt any other nation. Imports become cheaper due to strong dollar demand. America can fund an enormous military, 800 plus overseas bases, multiple simultaneous wars, without typical economic constraints. It's what economists call an exorbitant privilege. As of 2023, approximately 80% of global oil transactions were still conducted in dollars. This system is the foundation of American financial hegemony. It enables the US to essentially tax world trade through monetary policy. It's worth trillions of dollars to the American economy. And any threat to this system represents an existential challenge to American power. Which brings us back to Saddam Hussein and November 2000. When Iraq announced it would sell oil in euros instead of dollars under the UN Oil for Food program, American experts fell about laughing. They thought it was an emotional, economically irrational decision. The euro was at record lows. UN officials warned Iraq would lose millions in currency conversion fees and reduced interest on escrow accounts. One Middle East expert called it impossible to understand on economic grounds. But Saddam's gamble paid off brilliantly. Between late 2000 and March 2003, the euro appreciated approximately 17% against the dollar. Iraq's $10 billion reserve fund held in euros gained that same 17% in value. Contrary to all predictions, the switch was financially successful. And Iraq, with 112 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the second largest in the world after Saudi Arabia, had just proven that oil could be successfully traded in a currency other than the dollar. This was the real threat. Not the euro switch itself, but the precedent. If Iraq profited from euro pricing, other OPEC nations would consider following Iran began discussing switching to euros. Venezuela explored euro pricing and barter arrangements. Russia showed interest in euro-denominated oil sales. The demonstration effect was the critical danger. Economic analyses at the time predicted that if OPEC switched to euros, oil importing nations would need to dump dollars and buy euros. A massive sell-off of dollar reserves globally could crash the dollar 20 to 40% in value long-term. It meant loss of artificial global dollar demand, the end of America's ability to print unlimited money without immediate inflation, collapse of American financial hegemony, and the loss of the exorbitant privilege of reserve currency status. The US would be unable to fund its massive military without severe economic consequences. Now look at the timeline. November 2000, Iraq switches to euros. September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacks the World Trade Center. Iraq had zero connection to those attacks. All 19 hijackers were Saudi or Egyptian nationals. But 9 days after 9/11, the Project for the New American Century, a neoconservative think tank whose members included Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, sent a letter to President Bush explicitly calling for regime change in Iraq. The letter stated, even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack, any strategy aiming at the eradication of terrorism and its sponsors must include a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Notice that language. Even if Iraq wasn't connected in 9/11, they should be invaded anyway. The terrorism justification was window dressing. The real agenda had been set years earlier. In fact, PNAC had sent a letter to President Clinton in January 1998, 3 years before 9/11, 5 years before the invasion, calling for the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime. The Iraq Liberation Act, making regime change official U.S. policy, was signed by Clinton in October 1998. Throughout 2002, the Bush administration built the public case for war, focusing on weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell's February 2003 UN presentation was the culmination. But the presentation wasn't prepared by the CIA. It was prepared by Vice President Cheney's office. The State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research flagged many claims as weak, not credible, or highly questionable. CIA analysts were uncomfortable with the cherry-picked intelligence Powell would later call the speech a blot on his record, and admit a lot of it turned out to be wrong. On March 19th, 2003, President Bush ordered the invasion. Baghdad fell on April 9th. Bush declared mission accomplished on May 1st. And then on June 5th, 2003, just 2.5 months after the invasion, Iraq's oil sales were switched back to US dollars. This was the first major economic policy action of the occupation. Before comprehensive WMD searches, before democratic elections, before infrastructure reconstruction, before security was even stabilized, the immediate priority was returning Iraq's oil to dollar denomination. Think about what this reveals. If weapons of mass destruction were the real motive, why wasn't finding them the first priority? If spreading democracy was the goal, why not start establishing democratic institutions? If terrorism was the concern, why not focus on security? The answer is obvious, because none of those were the actual objectives. The dollar switch in June 2003 is the smoking gun. It reveals what the war was really about, and the message was received. After witnessing Iraq's fate, no other major OPEC producer attempted an euro switch despite the euro's continued strength. The demonstration effect worked perfectly, challenged the petrodollar, and faced regime change. The fear of US military response became a powerful deterrent. Even though the invasion cost over $3 trillion, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and left Iraq in chaos, from the perspective of protecting dollar hegemony, it was a success. The petrodollar system remained intact. I know what some of you are thinking. Couldn't there be other explanations? Let's go through them. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction? This is completely debunked. 0 WMDs were found despite extensive searches. No active weapons programs were discovered. David Kay admitted, "We were almost all wrong." The Senate Intelligence Report in 2008 confirmed that the Bush administration systematically misrepresented intelligence Iraq had destroyed its special weapons in the 1990s per UN mandates. Over 70 UN inspections before the war found nothing. This justification was a deliberate lie. Saddam was a brutal dictator. True, but insufficient. Saddam had been brutal for 20-plus years without US invasion. The US previously supported Saddam in the 1980s against Iran and provided him with weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. Worse dictators exist that the US doesn't invade or even actively supports. Saudi Arabia is equally undemocratic, but is a close US ally. If humanitarian concern was the motive, why not Rwanda, Sudan, North Korea, or Zimbabwe? This doesn't explain the specific timing of 2003. Spread democracy to the Middle East. Why specifically Iraq among all Middle Eastern dictatorships? Saudi Arabia, our ally, is an absolute monarchy. And the results disprove this. Motive: Iraq became less stable, sectarian violence exploded, ISIS emerged from the chaos, and democracy remains fragile at best. Control oil generally. The US could buy Iraqi oil without invasion. Iraq was willing to sell oil. They were selling under the Oil for Food program. Invasion wasn't necessary to access oil supplies. But what the US couldn't allow was the currency used to price that oil. The need wasn't oil itself, but dollar denomination control over pricing currency was the issue. 9/11 revenge and the war on terrorism. Iraq had zero connection to 9/11. All hijackers were Saudi or Egyptian. Al-Qaeda operated from Afghanistan. Not Iraq. Osama bin Laden was based in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Bush administration falsely implied a connection in public statements, and surveys showed a majority of Americans believed Iraq was involved in 9/11. This belief was deliberately cultivated despite no evidence. Even Bush later admitted Iraq had no role in 9/11. Every official explanation has been proven false, but the petrodollar explanation fits perfectly. The timing, 2.5 years from Euro switch to invasion, shows rapid response to a strategic threat. The June 2003 dollar switch was the immediate priority post-invasion. No other OPEC nation switched currencies after witnessing Iraq's fate. The scale of US response, massive military invasion, 8-year occupation, $3 trillion cost, is proportionate to an existential economic threat, not to humanitarian concerns or terrorism, and most importantly, the pattern repeated with Libya. Let me tell you about Muammar Gaddafi. In 2009, as president of the African Union, Gaddafi proposed the African dinar, a gold-backed currency for African oil transactions that would replace the US dollar. Libya had 144 tons of gold reserves, similar amounts in silver, and 46.4 billion barrels of oil, the largest reserves in Africa. The proposal was designed as an alternative to both the dollar and the French franc that controls Francophone African countries. Over 53 African nations in the Pan-African Parliament were considering the plan. This represented another massive threat to Western monetary control. In February 2011, during the Arab Spring, anti-Gaddafi protests began in Libya. By March, NATO intervention started, led by the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. It was framed as responsibility to protect, a humanitarian intervention to prevent a massacre of civilians. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was the primary advocate. On October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was captured and killed by opposition fighters backed by NATO air support. Hillary Clinton's reaction when told of his death? "We came, we saw he died." She literally laughed while saying it on CBS News. But what the public didn't know at the time were the real motivations, which would be revealed 4 years later. In 2015, approximately 3,000 emails from Hillary Clinton's private server were released. One email, dated April 2nd, 2011, during the early weeks of the Libya intervention, came from Sidney Blumenthal, a longtime Clinton confidant. The email stated, Gaddafi's government holds 143 tons of gold and a similar amount in silver. This gold was accumulated prior to the current rebellion and was intended to be used to establish a Pan-African currency based on the Libyan golden dinar. This plan was designed to provide the Francophone African countries with an alternative to the French franc. The email continued. According to knowledgeable individuals, this quantity of gold and silver is valued at more than $7 billion. French intelligence officers discovered this plan shortly after the current rebellion began, and this was one of the factors that influenced President Nicolas Sarkozy's decision to commit France to the attack on Libya. Read that again. The gold dinar plan was explicitly cited as a factor in the decision to invade. Not humanitarian concerns, not protecting civilians, the currency threat. And what happened immediately after Gaddafi's death? The gold dinar plan was abandoned. All Libyan oil returned to being sold in dollars and euros. The gold reserve's fate remains unclear to this day. And Libya was left as a failed state. Multiple competing governments, ongoing tribal warfare, ISIS-controlled territory for years, a refugee crisis, and no functioning national government. The pattern is identical to Iraq. Leader proposes alternative currency for oil. Western intervention follows. Leader is killed. Alternative currency plan is abandoned. Oil returns to Western currencies. Country left in chaos? This isn't coincidence. This is policy. Now, I want to address the Israeli factor because it's important context. The project for the New American Century included many neoconservatives with strong ties to Israel's Likud party. 10 of PANAC's founding members entered the Bush administration: Dick Cheney as vice president, Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz as Deputy Secretary of Defense. These were the architects of the Iraq War. Israel strongly supported the invasion. Saddam had fired Scud missiles at Israel during the 1991 Gulf War and provided payments to families of Palestinian suicide bombers. Israeli intelligence, some later proven unreliable, was shared with the U.S. A 1996 memo called A Clean Break, written for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by Richard Perle, David Wormser, and Douglas Faith, all later Bush officials, called for regime change in Iraq 7 years before the invasion. So were there dual motivations? Absolutely. Petrodollar protection and Israeli security concerns both played roles. These motives weren't contradictory. They were mutually reinforcing neocons, served both American hegemony and Israeli interests. Both required eliminating Saddam's regime. The coalition succeeded because multiple factions united behind the war for different reasons. But the petrodollar motive explains the timing, the immediate post-invasion priorities, and why the pattern repeated with Libya. Let's talk about costs. The Iraq War cost the United States over $2.2 trillion, according to Brown University's Cost of War project, with long-term costs through 2053 estimated at $3.9 trillion when including veterans' care and interest on borrowed money. 4,491 U.S. soldiers were killed. 32,220 were wounded, but those numbers pale in comparison to Iraqi casualties. Conservative estimates document 186,000 to 210,000 violent civilian deaths. Survey-based estimates range much higher. The Lancet study estimated 655,000 total deaths through 2006. The PLOS medicine study calculated 461,000 deaths through 2011. Brown University estimates over 315,000 direct war violence deaths in Iraq, with indirect deaths from disease, malnutrition, and healthcare collapse several times higher. Over 70% of violent deaths were civilians. Millions were displaced. An entire nation was destroyed based on lies. And for what? To protect a monetary system that enables American empire, to maintain the ability to print unlimited money that the world must absorb, to preserve dollar hegemony that allows the US to fund 800 plus military bases worldwide without immediate economic consequences. To send a message to any nation that dares challenge the petrodollar, we will destroy you. But here's what's changing. The world is becoming multipolar. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it's willing to accept yuan for Chinese oil purchases, a major shift after 50 years of dollar-exclusive arrangements. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are discussing a common currency that could compete with the dollar. Russia and China conduct bilateral energy trade in rubles, and yuan India pays Russia for oil in rupees. These challengers have nuclear weapons and large militaries. The US cannot use the Iraq playbook against major powers. The petrodollar monopoly is slowly eroding. The dollar still dominates about 60% of global foreign exchange reserves and 80% of oil transactions, but that's down from historical highs. The system is weakening, not because of military intervention, but because multipolarity makes enforcement impossible. You can invade Iraq, you can bomb Libya, but you can't invade China or Russia. Economic sanctions are less effective against large economies. The petrodollar system that seemed invincible in 2003 is now showing cracks. So, what's the lesson here? First, always question official justifications for war. The WMD claims were obvious lies if you looked critically at the evidence. The media failed to challenge the narrative. Skeptics were marginalized as conspiracy theorists, but the skeptics were right. Second, understand that economic imperialism is real. The US military doesn't just defend American territory, it enforces the global financial system. Follow the money, and you'll understand foreign policy better than any official explanation. The massive US military presence in the Persian Gulf, bases in Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Yemen, isn't primarily about terrorism or democracy. It's about protecting the dollar system. Third, recognize patterns. Iraq challenged the petrodollar and was destroyed. Libya challenged Western monetary control and was destroyed. Venezuela, Iran, and Syria all face constant US pressure, and all have explored alternatives to dollar-based trade. The pattern is clear and predictable. Fourth, the cost of empire is massive. $3 trillion spent on Iraq, hundreds of thousands of lives destroyed. An entire region destabilized. ISIS emerged from the chaos, millions of refugees. And for what? To maintain a monetary system that's eroding anyway as the world becomes multipolar? The attempt to preserve dollar hegemony through violence is failing as power diffuses globally. And finally, the official story is almost always incomplete or false. Weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. Iraq had no connection to 9/11. Democracy wasn't established. The region didn't become more stable. Every justification failed. But the petrodollar was protected, at least temporarily. Iraq's oil returned to dollars. Libya's gold dinar died with Gaddafi. The message was sent: challenge the system and face annihilation. Colin Powell died in 2021. Before his death, he spent years trying to rehabilitate his reputation, calling his UN presentation the worst blot on his record. But those words ring hollow when hundreds of thousands of people are dead because of lies he told. Donald Rumsfeld died in 2021 without ever apologizing. Dick Cheney died earlier this month. The architects of this war faced no consequences, no war crimes trials, no accountability. They lived freely while Iraq remains broken. The Iraq War wasn't about weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't about 9/11. It wasn't about spreading democracy. It was about protecting the petrodollar system, the foundation of American financial hegemony that enables endless deficit spending, global military presence, and imperial power. Saddam Hussein challenged that system by switching to euros. Gaddafi proposed an alternative with gold dinars. Both were eliminated, their countries destroyed. The message received globally. But the system they died defending is now dying anyway. Not through war, but through the natural emergence of a multipolar world where challengers are too powerful to invade. The petrodollar is eroding, the dollar monopoly is weakening, and the horrific violence inflicted on Iraq and Libya to preserve it will be remembered as the death throes of American empire. a desperate attempt to maintain hegemony through force when the world had already moved beyond unipolar dominance. That's the real story of the Iraq War. That's what hundreds of thousands of people died for. Not freedom, not democracy, not protecting America from threats. They died for a monetary system, for financial hegemony, for empire. And we should never forget it. Thank you for watching My Money Minute. If this deep dive into the real reasons behind the Iraq War got you thinking about how financial power drives foreign policy, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. What topics would you like me to cover in future videos? I'll see you in the next one.